Today we're going to focus on the essentials for World War II, and at times this may feel a little bit like a world history review because it goes a bit beyond America's role, but I think you'll benefit from remembering all of the factors that went into the Second World War. So let's try to answer the question of what caused this Second Great War to erupt only about 20 years after the First Great War. First of all, you can remember, and you may have had this last year, the FAIL acronym. There are really four main factors that lead to World War II. First of all, the failures of the Treaty of Versailles to actually address the problems that caused the First World War. When you reflect on Germany being made to pay for the entire war and to accept guilt for the entire war, it leads to a weakened Germany that's going to be ripe for a dictator to rise to power. We're also going to see the aggression of new totalitarian dictators throughout Europe, taking territory and imposing their will on other countries, and really not finding anybody to stop them. And that leads to inaction. The world community really doesn't do anything to address this aggression. It doesn't punish these leaders in any way, and it doesn't hold them accountable. In fact, sometimes we give in to them, and that's a process called appeasement, when you give someone what they want so that they'll stop. And I think we all know that giving in to a bully doesn't stop the bullying. And then finally, the League of Nations as an organization is too weak to enforce any of its policies. There's no standing army, and without the United States being a permanent member, the League doesn't really go anywhere. As we know, whenever there's a country that's dealing with economic problems, there's also the possibility of a revolution. And during the period between World War I and World War II, we saw runaway inflation in Germany. Germany having trouble repaying its war debts and reparations. We talked about the tariff wars that went on during the 1920s. And ultimately what happens is that international trade comes to a standstill. And once the stock market collapses in 1929, we see the full-on Great Depression take over not only the United States but the rest of the world as well. And all of this economic weakness creates an opportunity for strong rulers to come to power. As you can see, these are rulers not only in Europe, but also in Asia, and even in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt fits the mold of a strong leader coming to power during a time of crisis. In the mid-1930s and into the late 1930s, we start to see Germany and Italy taking aggressive action to invade bordering territories. And obviously Germany invading Czechoslovakia and parts of Austria, Italy invading Albania, Ethiopia, and Libya. These are issues that really called for other foreign nations to step in and stop them. But instead of stepping in to stop them, they turned to a policy of appeasement. And the idea is that if we give these aggressive dictators what they're asking for, they'll be satisfied and they'll stop. And of course, we know that that's not the case. The historical hindsight that we have shows that if Britain and other allied nations had stood up to Hitler in the late 1930s, not only would World War II maybe not have happened, but maybe the Holocaust wouldn't have happened either. Hitler is going to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, led at this point by Joseph Stalin. And this is a secret agreement that basically is based on the idea that they're going to reconquer Poland and divide it up between the two of them. Now, obviously, this cartoon's a great example because both Hitler and Stalin have a pistol behind their backs, not fully trusting the other side and knowing that the other side is hungry for power. The real spark that ignites World War II is known as the German Blitzkrieg, which is a surprise invasion of Poland in September of 1939. And this is the thing that gets the attention of the Allies. This is the moment at which they realize appeasement hasn't worked and that they need to do something. It may be too late at this point, but they understand that they need to do something. As we said before, the two sides are going to be the Axis powers, made up of Germany, Italy, and an unlikely ally of Japan. It's all the way across the globe, but it's also an industrialized, militarized nation that has fascist leaders. And they're going to support each other's expansion, but not technically be fully involved in each other's business. At the beginning of the war, the Allied powers are just Britain and France, and the United States, the Soviet Union, Spain, Belgium, and others claim to be neutral, although we know that the Soviet Union now had a secret agreement with the Axis powers. Poor Belgium. Just like World War I, Germany invades through Belgium at the beginning of the war, and British forces that are trying to stop them there get humiliated and defeated and pushed all the way back to the sea, where they have to retreat and be rescued at Dunkirk. By June of 1940, Hitler's forces have come into the center of France, and obviously in this chilling photograph, you've got Hitler and some of his lieutenants standing at the Eiffel Tower, or with the Eiffel Tower in the background. And so France gets divided into two parts, basically. One part that is still the traditional French government, and the other part that's called Vichy France, which is controlled by the Nazi government. So it seems at this point Hitler is on a roll, and he really hasn't been stopped yet. It's not going to be until the Battle of Britain that he finally meets his match. And in this particular case, the British Air Force is able to detect that German planes are coming and to ride out the intense bombing. And this actually causes Hitler to give up on trying to conquer the British Isles and turn his attention back to Stalin, which is another problem on the horizon. It's around this time that President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill see each other for the first time in person to discuss a potential response to what's going on in Europe. And so they meet at the Atlantic Conference, which we see in the class video on FDR, on a battleship in the North Atlantic where there are German submarines all over the place. It's a very risky meeting, but they need to meet in secret because Roosevelt is not allowed to take sides in this war based on all the neutrality laws that are in place. One of the agreements that they make is that it will be a little while before Roosevelt can convince the American public and Congress to go to war, but that we will step in and we will aid the Allies. And in the process, before we can formally declare war, Roosevelt's going to come up with ways to help the British without actually declaring war. And one of the key ways that he does that is through the Lend-Lease Act, which you also saw in the class video on Roosevelt. The big agreement at the Atlantic Conference is that Japan and Germany are both problems, but Germany's the bigger problem, and Germany needs to be dealt with first. And once the Germans are defeated, then they can focus their attention on Japan. One of the problems that arises at this point is that it was going to happen sooner or later, and it ends up happening in 1941, that Hitler decides to break the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union by invading. And this is actually history shows that invading the Soviet Union is a bad idea, especially when you decide to do it in the winter. And the Soviet troops, as they retreat, are using slash and burn or scorched earth techniques to destroy any supplies that would aid the German troops. And so the Germans get bogged down and end up fighting brutal battles, especially the Battle of Stalingrad, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's just a political cartoon portraying the backstabbing that Hitler was doing. Forgive me, comrade, but it seems such a good opportunity. And that non-aggression pact goes out the window. So the trigger that gets the United States involved in this war for good, and the thing that gets the American public to turn away from isolation, is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I think that you guys know by now that on December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces bombed the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And this was primarily in response to the fact that Roosevelt was urging other nations to stop trading with Japan, to cut off their oil supplies, to cut off their steel supplies, anything that would help them fuel their industrial machinery for war. And so Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, where most of the U.S. naval fleet was stationed in the Pacific. And they thought that this would be a way to weaken the United States so that we would not be able to come into the war and fight them later. It had the opposite effect, which is that it gave the United States a stronger resolve to enter the war. So I'm going to play a quick video clip for you now of Roosevelt making the Day of Infamy speech, very famous from Pearl Harbor.
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
So the United States is at this point motivated to go to war. It's interesting because the Japanese attack us, but yet we choose to fight the war in Germany first, and we kind of put the Japanese fight on hold. So on December 8th, 1941, the United States is officially in the war on Japan, and then that, of course, triggers a war with Germany as well, because Japan and Germany are allies. Perhaps one of the most troubling, and I think most controversial aspects of Franklin Roosevelt's dealing with this war is to sign Executive Order 9066, which is known as the Japanese Internment Order. And this basically forces all Americans of Japanese ancestry, whether they're first generation, second generation, third generation Japanese, anyone living on the west coast of the United States in these typically Japanese American communities, are going to be rounded up, and they're going to be documented and then relocated to what are called internment camps in the interior of the United States, in places like Colorado and Wyoming and other interior areas. And the fear and the motivation behind this is that there's a fear that they may be agents of the Japanese government, or that they may be spies, or that they may have loyalties to the Japanese government. And for that reason, we need to basically put them into camps where they can be monitored. And this is very similar to the idea of what we did with Native Americans, although this time it's based on Japanese ancestry rather than Native American ancestry. Obviously, like in World War I, there's a lot of anti-foreign feelings. In this particular case, anti-Japanese feelings. There was anti-German feelings too, but I feel like the anti-Japanese feelings were even more exaggerated because the feeling was that they had attacked us directly on our soil. And so you see a lot of these types of images. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. I mean, it's so over the top to believe that someone would put up a sign like that, but there were really, really strong anti-Japanese feelings in America after Pearl Harbor. So I'm going to show you a quick clip on the Japanese internment. In fact, rather than embedding it in this screencast, I'm actually going to have you guys pause the screencast and go to Blackboard and watch the link there. And then we'll continue with the screencast after you watch the video. After Pearl Harbor, Japan feels as though it has the position to continue expanding throughout the Pacific, because really the U.S. military is in no position to retaliate at that point. The Navy needs to be rebuilt. The Army still needs to be built up. We need to draft soldiers into the Army. We need to produce weapons. As you saw in the class video on FDR, we were using cardboard weapons for training. We were so ill prepared for war. So the Japanese continue expanding their territory into other islands, which also includes American and Filipino forces trying to defend the Philippines, and they're conquered by Japan at the same time. So this is really a major Japanese imperial expansion, and the United States is going to have to wait to fight back until our military is ready.